Do you know what time it is? It's Supernatural Storytime. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Road Stories. I'm a trucker, and I have learned over the years that different areas have different stories to tell, different warnings to give. Currently, I'm working in the Backens oil fields in North Dakota, delivering sand using a pneumatic trailer to assist with fracking. Now, let's not let politics get in the way of weird shit, shall we? I'm just giving you an idea of where and letting you know the terrain. I'm sure all of you have heard of the black dog that the movie was made about. It's a story about the black dog that comes and takes everything away from you when truckers get too greedy and drive too tired. While the legend may have been embellished a little by Hollywood, there are very few truckers who haven't seen that particular dog late at night when pushing themselves just a little too hard. It usually is just a dip in the pavement that your headlights cast a shadow into that makes you think there's an actual object there. Then your mind, already tired, decides to make it move as a truck bounces, and suddenly you find yourself, at the very least, letting off the throttle and paying it a little more attention. While this story is something similar, I ran into out in these remote roads in the middle of nowhere in North Dakota. Middle of nowhere in North Dakota may sound redundant to someone who has never been here, but there are towns, cities, and people. But it does have some pretty remote spots, and it is often an easy 30 miles or better between population centers. Nothing at 2 a.m. but you, the road, and your truck. And the cold, the cold. I was surprised at how fast I started thinking that 15 degrees was a warm day. As I write this, it is currently -6. But one thing you do get out here is snow, and it tends to stay around. Never really leaves, though it will blow to someplace else quite often. Anyone who has ever driven in an area that gets snow has seen these road whispers. They are the little skeletal fingers of snow that reach across the road and blow around like dust in the wind. This is where my story really begins, I reckon. I'm a relatively new driver up here. Came to make some money for my family, and the money is quite good actually. But being the new guy anywhere will get you a little hazy. Finally, one of the older drivers, the only one I met who was actually from North Dakota, took me aside and said the one thing I needed to look out for was the road whispers. He said, pay attention to what they tell you. Otherwise, you will end up getting caught up by the whisper lady. I kind of grinned and asked what he was getting on about. He told me a story about how this lady was killed out on 200, but that she doesn't stay there. No, sir. She travels all the empty, desolate highways in the western part of the state, trying to find a driver who isn't on his game. And when she pops up, your best bet is hammer down and don't look back. He said it's counter to what you want to do, but she has gotten a dozen or more drivers over the past 20 years or so he knows of, probably more. I kept that shit-eating grin on my face and asked him to explain the whole damn thing. He sighed, but went on. He said it was the winter of 1992 when she passed on. He was a young driver at the time, but it made the news. She was an older Buick Regal, you know, the rear-wheel drive ones, and had gotten tail-happy out on 200 in a snowstorm. Put her ass into the ditch, but nothing hurt really but her pride. She was headed over to Manning to meet her folks for some reason or another. Doesn't matter why. He said she had crawled up to the road in the snow and wind when she saw the headlights of a truck coming down the road. The driver was on the end of running for 25 hours straight and never saw her to the last second. Maybe if he hadn't seen her at all, this would have a happier ending, but when he did see her, he panicked, slammed down the brakes hard. The trailer came around to the right, and well, if you understand physics, you probably know this had a horrible ending. She didn't stand a chance. Was cut down right on the side of the road. Her body lay next to her beloved Buick. Anyway, he said, just look out for the warnings. They will help you greatly if you should encounter her. He said there are spirits out on the road that will help you, try to keep you from falling victim to her. I asked him what exactly does she do to drivers. He said, I have no idea, but they either die then or not long after an encounter. I asked then, how the hell do you know it was this lady? He told me not many people freeze to death on the side of the road while standing next to a running and warm tractor trailer. He said at least one had written, whisper, on the ground of his truck. Well, this was all in good for a scary story to tell the rookie, I thought. Interesting, kind of spooky, and barely believable. But anyway, I was headed from Underwood to just west of Watford City to a well site. It was a cold night, wind blowing, and a light snow in the air. The road whispers were in full force, lazily blowing across the road at times, blowing like a rocker at others. I had been up for almost 30 hours, running my ass off making that sweet, sweet bank. Then I started seeing things in the snow blowing across the road. I laughed at myself, thinking how funny it is that your brain would try to freak you out, giving the snow images when it's just a bunch of random lines and curls. But they started getting really concise, very easy to pick out. And words. The word sleep popped up a few times. Then I saw the image of what looked like an old brass bed with a big arched headboard. Then one said, stop, aware. I started getting nervous. My heart quickened. Maybe it was a story. Or maybe it was the images, but somehow I knew I was entering a dark area of the highway. I was a good 15 miles from anything. Either way, it would not be a place to break down. Cell reception is fairly decent, but not a guarantee out here. I saw the image of a car in the whispers. Shit, if it didn't look like the front of an older Buick Regal. Now, I really knew something was not right. I slowed my speed down from 65 to a more relaxed 50. Not sure what would be on the other side of the next gentle hill, but pretty soon it wouldn't be something I wanted to see. Soon as I topped the hill and my headlights came to rest down the road, I saw her. She was all in white, pale as a goth chick. She stood in the middle of my lane, not 75 feet from me. There would be no time to stop. I gritted my teeth, time slowed down to an eternity. The only thing not white about here were her eyes. Such a deep, pure blue, and overly sized for her face. She stared down at me with a coy smile. I looked back. Remembered the story. Hammer down. I brought that big Peterbilt back to life and kept my foot in it. She snarled in my headlights beam and dove at the truck. I wanted to close my eyes but couldn't. I just saw her flying towards my windshield. Impact? Snow? Just snow blasted all around my cab, but a piercing shriek came out of nowhere, from no one. It chilled me. At this time I realized I let off the throttle again and got back on it. The blowing whispers in front of my truck said one word, run. I did. I didn't slow that truck down till Watford City. I pulled into a little gas station there. It was closed, but I just needed to get out, to walk. On the front of my Pete, the grill was impacted with snow. I had my run-in with the Whisper Lady, and I had survived. I'll never drive tired again. Next time, I'll let dispatch know he can kiss my ass. Money or no money, Daddy needs his rest. Fill the pages. In the military, you have to drop everything and move at a week's notice. Sometimes it's 1 week, and others it was a little longer. But we were constantly moving, never in the same place for more than a couple of years. My name is James, and I live with my mom and my stepdad. Both of them are in the military, and both have very important jobs. They never really have much time to deal with things going on at home, so most of the time I was alone. 1 year, we had a week to pack everything back up and move to the other side of the country. We decided to drive and spend some time together as a family. By this time, I was used to moving so quickly, but just dropping everything and leaving my friends still hurt. My best friend Cliff gave me a journal so I could sit and write about the things I was thinking about at the time. He told me that the journal was special and important to him. I never understood why, because he never liked writing. I thanked him for the gift, and I told him I would call as soon as possible. I wasn't like most 16-year-old boys. I wasn't into sports or girls or even having a car. I did like to write, though. Writing made me feel better about the harshness of the day and even took my mind into a different place sometimes, so the journal Cliff gave me made me feel much better about the move. I retrieved the journal from my bag and took a good look at it. It was heavy and larger than any other journal I had before. The cover was made out of some heavy, dark red leather. The clasp was made from felt and was the same color. Across the front, the words Moore's College had been either etched or carved into the heavy leather. I opened the journal, and the smell of the pages filled the cabin of the white 2010 Dodge Ram, but was quickly sucked out through the open windows. I sighed and started to fill the pages with the woes of my mind. I wrote until night fell around our truck. I looked out to the stars. They were so beautiful, and I quickly recognized some constellations. Every now and then I would see a figure, but it was late, and I was tired, so I shook my head and dismissed it as my mind playing tricks on me. I decided to take a quick nap after I finished writing. I woke about an hour later outside a big metal diner. I guess my parents had gone inside for something to eat, so I hopped out of the truck and walked up to the diner. Walking towards the diner, I felt uneasy, and when I looked around the parking lot, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Some cars along the lonely stretch of highway and a field of wheat across the road. The parking lot was only lit by the dimming yellow glow of the lone street light. I thought I saw someone standing just outside of the radius of the light, but again, I had just woken up, so I ignored the figure. Opening the door to the diner, I saw my parents sitting at the end booth, and I joined them, just as the waitress came up to take their order. After we finished eating, it was time to get back on the road and find some place to rest. Mother wanted to do the latter, but Father kept on insisting we keep driving. We ended up driving all night, so I went back to sleep. That night is when the dream started. I was running through the woods behind my old house, a place I used to run every day to clear my head and relax. It was starting to get dark, which never bothered me before, but I started to not recognize the landmarks on the trail. Everything was the same but somehow different. I came out to a clearing that I never recognized, so I decided to stop and rest. The moon and the stars dimly lit up the clearing, allowing me to see some of the things close to me. About 15 feet to my left was a tree. It was old and the leaves were gone, even though it was the middle of summer. The gaping hole in the middle of the tree seemed like something had ripped it out with claws or some kind of metal gauntlet. 20 feet to my right there was something that resembled a bed. It was made out of branches or bundled sticks and what appeared to be the leaves from the trees, stitched together to make a blanket. Then I saw the figure just out of sight, like it was at the diner. He whispered, "The journal has been passed," in a raspy voice that could only have belonged to a corpse. It laughed and launched himself forward, ripping me from sleep. I jolted awake and was drenched in sweat. Both of my parents were staring at me and the truck was stopped. The light of morning was streaking through the sky. After making sure I was fine, we set back off onto the road. We were driving all day and most of the night. We stopped at a dingy little motel that had one room left. After discussing for almost 15 minutes, my father paid for the room. We left the office thanking the man at the counter. There it was again, that feeling that someone was watching me. My eyes scanned the parking lot and even the dark corners of the motel. After looking around and not finding anything, the feeling went away and we went to our room. The pasty white eggshell paint was chipping off the walls and you could hear the TV in the next room over. It was the latest news story about a massacre at some diner along the highway. My father was the first one to hear it, so he turned on the TV and the news popped up on the dirty little screen. Inside are the 13 victims of the slaughter. Truckers, families, and workers were all victims of the daunting incident which police believe to be the work of several large men. I looked at the TV in absolute horror when I realized the diner in the background was a diner where I saw the figure. The video cut off and my father started to assure me that we were safe and there was nothing to be afraid of. I stepped outside to the walkway and started walking towards the vending machine. The hum and the dim glow of the vending machine were the only signs of color coming from the dark hallway. After getting a bottle of water, I turned around and saw the figure again. This time it was closer, and I could make out more of its features. At 7.5 feet tall, it was taller than most people I had ever seen. It wore a dark leather jacket with a hood and black jeans. I couldn't see into his hood because he held his head down, but I could feel the air around me turn as cold as ice. It never moved. It just stood there as I stared at it. It laughed. I took a step toward it. It pointed at me and said with its bone-chilling, raspy voice, "You have been chosen. Heed my warning." Then I blinked and it was gone. I opened the door to my room and my parents rushed to me. "Are you okay? Are you hurt? Where have you been?" Their questions confused me. I was only gone for a few minutes. I answered their questions and went to lie down. The surface of the sheets was scratchy like wool, but it definitely fit in with the rest of the room. It looked beat up and overused. The corners were eaten by moths and the stitching was patchy. I grabbed my journal from my bag. I wrote about the figure, the diner, and the trip across the country. After writing for around an hour and a half, I started to become tired, so I put the journal back into my bag. I slid down into the scratchy covers and rested my head on the stone-like pillow. I was back running through the woods again. I was back on the same path. I was running past the same trees. Then it got dark again, and I started to not recognize the forest. I came to the same clearing, but it was different. To my left there was a hill. The hill went up and then immediately cut off into a cliff. Something brought me to stand at the edge, standing there looking down, and I felt someone or something standing next to me. When I looked to my left, I didn't see anyone, so I looked to my right, and standing right there was Cliff. I turned to him, but he didn't look the same. Instead of his thick brown hair, he was missing patches of his hair, and his eyes were darkened. Instead of being the normal vibrant green, they were dull and looked as if they were losing color. His skin used to be tan and stretched over a muscled frame. Now he looked as if he had been starved for weeks and kept inside. I stood there looking at him in disbelief. I knew it was him, but how did he go through such an extreme change? He turned his head to look at me, and I could hear his bones grinding together. I could hear the spinal disc moving over one another. My blood turned to ice when his eyes met mine. "What happened to you?" He looked at me for what seemed an eternity, and when he didn't answer, I asked him again. He leaned forward, and then I could actually see the horror decay in his eyes. His hands pulled at his flesh, and then I saw his mouth, or what would have been his mouth. His lips were sewn shut like something didn't want him speaking or screaming anymore. His fingers began pulling at the line where his lips once were, and the line started to come apart. I'm sorry, James. I shouldn't have given." His words were cut off when the figure in the leather jacket shoved him over the cliff. I stared at where Cliff had just been standing. It could only see the figure's deformed hand. It looked like it was once human, but now the flesh was peeling and cracking at the joints. I looked into the figure's face, still in shock at seeing my best friend shoved off over a cliff. It was much closer now, closer than it had ever been before. I could actually make out its features this time. Its eyes were like two soulless pits of darkness and glowed with a faint blue. Its lips, nose, and cheeks had burnt off and showed its teeth, which were yellowed and unnaturally sharpened. "I'm closer to you than you can ever imagine. You cannot escape the debt you owe. No one can escape their debt." It grabbed my shoulder and stared into my eyes. "Please help me. You have to find a way for me to escape. You cannot outrun him. You have to fight." The voice came from the figure, but there was no way. It could have actually been the figure talking. "Please, you have to save me. Save us." Then I recognized the voice. It was weak and sounded strained, but there was no doubt. It was my voice. That's when I woke up. I woke up covered in sweat. My mother was on the phone crying, and my father was standing over me, wrapping a towel around my shoulders. "What is going on?" I looked down to see the towel turning darker and darker red. I started freaking out and tore the towel away to reveal 4 deep cuts into my shoulder, right where the stalker, as I've come to start calling it, held me in my dream. The ambulance showed up 4 minutes later, and the paramedics started hooking me up to an oxygen tank and strapped me down to the gurney. I started to get dizzy, and the edge of my vision started to black out. Just before I blacked out, I heard my weakened voice from my dream. You have to find a way to fight him. He will take more. The black abyss of unconsciousness surrounded me as I passed out. I awoke several hours later inside a hospital with bandages wrapped all around my shoulder and chest. The nurse walked in carrying a chart and a new IV bag. After changing the IV, she noticed I was awake and called in the doctor. Well, well, look who's finally awake, he said with a smile. You scared your parents there, son. You have lost a lot of blood. He wasn't a very tall man, and he looked very friendly. His soft brown eyes were warm and inviting, probably something that helped to ease patients. He had dark curly brown hair that framed his face, which was covered in light freckles that came down the right side of his neck. He smiled at me again as he started checking all of my vital signs. He listened to my heart using the ice-cold stethoscope that is given to every doctor anywhere. He listened to my lungs and looked at my throat and my ears. My parents burst into the room and my mother immediately burst into tears. My father just stood at the foot of my bed waiting for the doctor to finish checking on me. After the doctor was finished, he asked me if I would be okay with a roommate. I just gently nodded and he left the room. What happened to me? I asked my father. We aren't exactly sure. One minute you were mumbling in your sleep about Cliff and yourself, and the next you were screaming when your shoulders split 4 different times. I contemplated telling them about my dreams, but I decided against it because it would seem crazy, and that's the last thing I needed right now. My mother stopped crying enough to engage in light conversation. What do you think happened to you? My mother asked me. I don't have any idea. I was very hesitant in my answer because I had a very good idea of what happened. Another nurse came in and told my parents that visiting time was over and they had to leave. As they walked out of the room, another man was wheeled in. He was a tall man. He barely fit on his gurney. The doctors transferred him to the bed and attached hoses and cords to him. The heart rate monitor jumped to life with lights and sounds. His heart rate was irregular and jumped every 3 or 4 seconds. The man had dark sunken eyes. One looked as if half a golf ball was implanted on top of it. It was swollen and had blood running from the corner of his eye to behind his ear. Half of his face looked as if it had met the business end of sandpaper. His cheek was missing and part of his nose was gone. The curtain separating the beds was suddenly pulled shut, cutting off my sight to my new roommate. I sighed and switched on the TV. Some action movie was playing, so I left it on. However, it could not hold my attention for more than a few minutes at a time. I pushed the button to call a nurse, but no one came for what seemed like half an hour. I pushed the button again, and a male nurse walked in. What can I do for you? He asked me. Can you bring me something to eat? I feel like I haven't eaten anything in a week. I asked him. That's because you haven't. He walked back out, and my mind started reeling. What did that mean? How long have I been out? Was it just a week, or was it longer than that? I must have been thinking for a long time because it seemed like the nurse had just left when he touched my arm. Are you okay? I didn't even see him walk back into the room, not to mention put my table up and put down the food right in front of me. How long have I been here? I asked him. You were admitted 9 days ago. I thanked the nurse, and as he left, he told me to enjoy my food, which I did very much. As I was eating, I didn't even notice all the nurses and doctors leave the bed next to mine. The only reason I did was the man speaking to me. Hey, can you hear me? I looked around but couldn't find the voice. I was too focused on other things. I forgot about the man next to me. Hey, is anyone else in the room with me? I spoke up and told him I was there. He asked if I knew what had happened to him. Of course I didn't know, but I told him that he was in some kind of accident. He asked about me and why I was there. I was hesitant to tell him, so I made up some things and told him I fell off a mountain bike and injured my shoulder. That sounds eventful, he said. He must have called a nurse to come pull the curtain back, because that's what happened. He looked over at me and sat up. My name is Eric. Nice to meet you, Eric. I'm James. Eric moved his fingers in a wave motion and then shook his feet. He sighed and shook his head. He looked up at me and noted on the time. I guess he didn't want to keep talking. He lay back down and faced away from me. He turned back and said something that kept me awake for a day. You know, you can't stop him, right? We didn't speak much after that, but the rest of my stay I felt uneasy. I didn't want to go back to sleep, but it somehow found its way into my head. I slowly drifted off against all of my attempts to stay awake. There I was again, running through the forest. Again, it was darkness, and again I came to the clearing. It was lighter this time, and I could clearly see across the clearing. There were trees on the other side of the clearing. To my right there was another cliff, but I wasn't at the edge. I was at the base. I could look up to see the edge, but I couldn't see anything over it. The rock looked like steel and clay mixed together. The cliff that was to my left was gone and replaced with a small mound of dirt, kind of like a pitcher's mound in a baseball field. Then I did something I'd never have done before. I turned around. I thought, I'll just run back down the trail. So I started running again. I ran and ran and ran. It seemed like it went on forever, and it seemed like it would never end. I started to see things that looked familiar. I noticed something that made me stop. The trail was coming to an end. I walked to the end of the trail and then I saw it. It looked run down, and as if someone was trying to destroy it. But I would know my own house anywhere. Taking a drive into terror. So my girlfriend and I were bored one Saturday. It was really a nice day, and we decided to take a drive up the coast through the redwood forest. This was one of our favorite places to visit. We are both pretty outdoorsy and enjoy hiking along trails and spending time far out in woods. This day we decided to take a different route than we normally did. We very quickly found ourselves lost. Neither of us were really concerned because the scenery was so nice, the weather was amazing, and we figured we wouldn't have too much trouble finding our way back. We parked the car along the shoulder on a dirt path clear of the road and ventured into the woods. We probably hiked about an hour into the woods before settling down and enjoying the picnic my girlfriend had made. We were far enough away from the highway and usual hiking paths that it felt like it was just in the woods. After eating, we packed up and hiked back to the car. When we got to the car, I immediately noticed that both of my right tires were flat. It looked like there was a sharp rock stuck in the tires and more like it around the car. I swore that the road was clear when I pulled up, but I could have been mistaken, taken aback by the view and the day. We were pretty deep in the woods and far from a busy road. We imagined that there wouldn't be anyone traveling down the road anytime soon and considered our options. We didn't have cell reception or Wi-Fi to call for help, and we thought it was best to stay together. After waiting a little over an hour and seeing the sun begin to set, we decided to walk back the way we came. We hadn't made it 20 yards away from our car when we saw a man walking towards us. He looked like your average rustic guy, over 6 feet tall with a light brown beard and long hair, wearing an old red trucker hat, Wrangler jeans and worn leather boots. He noticed us, then saw the car behind us. "Car trouble?" he asked, stopping just short of us. "Yeah, looks like we got a flat," I said, looking back at the car. "No spare?" "You gotta have a spare." "Two flats," I said with a sigh. "I see," the man said, stroking his beard. I wasn't sure what it was about him, but something seemed off. Not just about him, but the whole situation. My girlfriend sensed it too. She looped her arm into mine and stood close, a little behind me. Not seeing the rocks when we pulled up, neither of us noticing any trouble as we went into the woods, and then the stranger finding us here right as we decided to walk back. It almost seemed staged. "My place is a few miles up the road, about a 50-minute walk. Closer than the nearest highway. You can come with me and call a tow truck," the man offered. "You live all the way out here, alone?" my girlfriend asked in a very suspicious tone. "Not much of a people person," the man barked back. "Just trying to help. Don't see a much better option when the sun's setting and all." He was right. We didn't really have anywhere else to go. We didn't even have a flashlight. It was warm during the day, but I knew it could get cold at night. Then in the morning, we would be stuck in the same position we were today. Against our better judgment, I accepted the man's offer. Just as we began walking with him, we saw a truck coming our way. It was a park ranger. My girlfriend went running up to flag him down. He led us right in his car, and when I looked back to tell the man we were going to get a ride, he was already gone. Apparently the ranger had come down to check on an old water line. He had to take some water samples and make sure it wasn't polluting a nearby creek. He said they only did this once every couple of months. Man, are we lucky, I said, happy to have a ride back into town where we could call AAA. We were about to walk 50 minutes deeper into the woods to get to a man's cabin. The ranger looked at me perplexed. No one lives out here. There aren't any homes, he said. I could hear in his voice that he was certain. No, we saw a man walking down the path, my girlfriend added. What man? We both realized that the ranger didn't see him and just let it go. The next day, AAA got my car and everything was normal again. We all but forgot about that whole incident until a few weeks later we saw a picture of the man we came across in the woods. Apparently he was wanted for murder. His MO was to stage accidents and come to the rescue. Only instead of helping, he would kidnap, torture, and murder his victims. My girlfriend and I haven't been in the woods since. The little monkey. I've never told this story to anyone. The only other person that is aware of it is my best friend, who was there with me that day. We both decided a long time ago that it was for the best that we just forget about the whole thing completely. Mainly because we were certain that whomever we did tell the story to would immediately seek to have us locked away in some mental institution. It's one of those things that doesn't make any sense on so many levels, and yet it's all entirely true. And I wish every day that it wasn't. That none of it ever happened to us. But it did, and I realize now that it's just something I have to live with, and in some sort of cathartic release, I'm telling it to you today. I think I have to. Maybe I could even get a few answers. I don't know. It's worth a try. I know you probably won't believe any of it, and that's okay. Most of the time, I have a hard time believing it myself. But in the end, this is my story, and God help anyone who stumbles on that house in those mountains like we did that night so long ago. It was the summer of '07. Both my friend and I were 17 years old at the time. I won't use his real name for various reasons, but for story purposes, we'll call him Lewis. Anyway, Lewis and I were on our way back from a day of cliff jumping in the Catskills. For the layman, that's jumping off a really high rock ledge into a pool of water, usually into a lake or a deep river. Before I go any further, let me first point out that we ended up taking my car, which was a tan, partially rusted out 1996 Toyota Corolla. Don't get me wrong, it was a great little car. It got awesome gas mileage and was perfect for zipping around town. I loved the shit out of that little guy, but its days were most certainly numbered, and it was no vehicle of choice for a long road trip to the mountains. Taking the old Corolla was a decision we would later regret. So after a day of defying gravity, the spot was known as Fawn's Leap, by the way. Some of you may have heard of it. We set out for home. It was nearing dinner time, almost 7 at night, and all that jumping and tempting death sure stirred up a hunger in us, so we stopped at a diner for a quick meal. The name of the diner escapes me now, but just picture any old roadside diner still stuck in the past, with its glistening metallic siding and flickering red neon sign. A haven for truckers and locals, no doubt. Once inside, we were immediately met with curious eyes. It was like a scene out of a movie. The music seemed to cut out, and every haggard patron in the place turned all at once to stare us down. We froze, like most animals often do when about to be eaten alive. It's a defense mechanism. I don't know if I told Lewis what I was doing, but I began to turn back towards the door in hopes of making a run for the car. My escape was thwarted by the raspy voice of Beth, one of the waitresses, who kindly offered us menus and a booth to hide in. We accepted and followed her toward the corner of the room. We both got cheeseburgers and fries. I remember because they were damn good cheeseburgers. A 10 out of 10 for sketchy diner standards. The threat of our presence disappeared fairly quickly as the angry glances began to turn back to their dried steaks and ashtrays. While we ate, I noticed that it had started to rain, which was just perfect. Any sane driver will tell you that driving in the rain, especially at night, is one of the worst situations you could be in. And you thought jumping off cliffs into some icy mountain water was dangerous. The next time it's raining at night, take a trip to the gas station for some ice cream, as you can make it back alive before the ice cream has melted all over your seats. It's no joke. I reiterated this to Lewis, advising that maybe we should wait it out. Of course, he wasn't the one that had to drive, so he could care less and shoved off the warnings. I believe his exact words were, "Stop being such a bitch." My best friend of nearly my whole life, right there expressing his sound words of encouragement. We had finished our burgers and what cold fries we had left, and eventually made for the exit. Lewis went to the car while I settled the bill with Beth. As she rang me up, I mentioned my reservations about driving home in this weather, along with my little knowledge of the exact roads, and asked if she knew any alternate routes. She asked where we were going, and I told her. She paused and thought about it. I knew she was thinking about it because she curled her mouth weird and looked at the ground. You know how some people often curl their mouth, contorting in this strange manner that makes their whole face look deformed? While Beth was there thinking up a storm, someone in the booth behind her shouted at me. I didn't catch his name, though, looking back on it. I wish I did so I could go back and find him and ask him why he told me about that road. He was older, maybe in his 60s, and his clothes were dirty and his hat was dirty. Everything was dirty, actually, about him. He also had several scars around his face, bad ones. Pretty unsightly, honestly. It was no wonder he was sitting alone. Despite his appearance, he kindly asked where I was heading again. I told him. He looked at me and grinned and said to take Karen Drive, about 30 miles down on the left. It was the fastest way. What a nice man, I thought. Who cares if he looks like he'd just been run over by a lawnmower? I smiled stupidly and thanked him for the directions, and I went to leave, but then Beth stopped me and got really serious. I knew she got really serious because she unraveled her mouth and looked at me from under her eyebrows. You know how serious people can do that sometimes? It can be really creepy, and old Beth doing it made it even creepier. She mumbled under her breath, "Don't go that way. Not tonight. Not in the dark." I thought that was pretty weird. That gentleman just told me it was the fastest way home. Surely something like that was common knowledge around here. "Not tonight," she mumbled again. "You won't make it back." Well, shit. Thoroughly creeped out, I thanked her for the delicious meal and got the hell out of there. I rushed to rejoin Lewis in the car. The rain was pouring down, a rogue summer storm, more than likely. The worst kind, if you ask me. Got in the car and went to start it. Nothing. Great. I thought, now we're going to be stuck here with Crazy Beth and the Catskill Crazies. Lewis gave me some more words of encouragement. "Just start the damn thing. I'm freezing." I gave it another go. The engine rumbled, struggling to turn over. "Come on," shouts Lewis. In an instant it starts. Thank God we could finally go home, I thought. Lewis slid down into his seat and pulled his hat over his eyes. "Just tell me when we're there," he said. "No problem," I replied, and we set out again for home. Except there was still one more unexpected stop on our trip that neither of us were ready for. We had only been driving for about maybe 40 minutes when we passed that road, Karen Drive, the one I had been advised to take and warned about all at once. I knew we still had at least an hour of driving until we reached the highway, but maybe Karen Drive would get us there quicker. Lewis was asleep still. I wasn't going to ask him. It was right there, just like the guy had said. That had to mean something, right? He wasn't a liar, at least I knew that much. But was Beth? Why was she so serious about it? It was just a shortcut. What did she know that I didn't? And why not tonight of all nights? It was pouring rain in the dark. Why wouldn't I take a shortcut home? I thought to myself while slowing down, ready to act. Am I going to listen to some crazy waitress or some crazy old man with more than one abnormality? Of course, the desperate and dumb 17-year-old that I was chose to side with the old man. I spun the car around and turned onto Karen Drive, with complete confidence that it would take us straight to the highway in no time at all. Lewis finally woke up and faintly asked what it was we were doing. What an idiot. We were driving home. I gripped the wheel and told him it was a shortcut. "Cool," he muttered, and went back to sleep. Another 30 minutes went by and still we were on Karen Drive, no closer to the highway home. I was getting worried. Maybe I had made the wrong decision. Maybe this wasn't the fastest route. Maybe the old man was hard of hearing and thought I was going somewhere else. Shit. Did he think I was going somewhere else? I couldn't be sure. He looked really old. Beth warned me. Did she even know where I was going? Did any of them hear a word I had said to them? I didn't know what to think anymore. I panicked, and then out of nowhere, a loud snap echoed from underneath the car. It scared the crap out of me. The steering wheel went stiff, and I could barely turn it. The engine squeaked and sputtered and smoked, started to trail out from underneath the hood. I pulled over immediately, fearing that the car was going to explode any minute, and I shook Louis awake. I was screaming, yelling at him that the car was on fire. Finally woke up and immediately jumped out of the car. It wasn't exactly the response I was expecting, but I didn't know what else to do, so I did the same. He was already about 10 yards down the road by the time I was out and yelled for him to wait for me, but he just kept running, the asshole. I went after him and watched as he jumped into the ditch on the side of the road. I crawled in next to him, and we both watched the car, waiting for it to ignite in a magnificent explosion. I hadn't been out of the car for more than 2 minutes, and I was already soaked. It was raining that hard. Louis finally asked me what happened, and I looked at him as if it were the stupidest question in the world. "I don't know," I admitted. We both went silent and continued to watch the car, the rain pounding down onto us. I braced for impact, except nothing happened. After several minutes of no explosions or flames, we collectively concluded that we were out of danger. We got out of the ditch and approached the car cautiously. As I got closer, I could hear the rain beating down on the hood and the steady sizzle as it hit. I already knew that it wasn't good. The old Corolla was toast. I opened up the hood for a closer look. Louis was rambling about something, but I just focused on the engine that was still smoking. Definitely not good. "I think it's overheated," I confessed. "No shit, it's overheated." "Now what are we gonna do?" Louis happily replied. "I'll call a tow truck." That was good enough for Louis, so I grabbed my phone out of the car only to find that I had no service. No way, I thought. This can't be the same time I don't have service. I wandered around the road, searching desperately for a signal. Nothing. I almost wanted to start laughing. I don't think there was ever a time in my life where I didn't have service. And now, at this exact moment, stranded on some country road in the pouring rain, I didn't have service. Louis knew immediately what was wrong. He checked his phone. Nothing. What on earth was happening? A simple trip to jump off some rocks had now led us to here, somewhere on Karen Drive in the middle of the night. Instincts kicked in, and I rounded on Louis to follow me up the road in hopes of finding a house where maybe, just maybe, the owners were still there and had a working telephone for us to use. Already dripping wet and without any other real options, we made our way further down Karen Drive. We had only walked several yards when I could see the faint orange illumination of windows in the distance. I ran into the woods for a better look. Up on top of the hill sat a giant house overlooking the road. It looked like some Victorian mansion. The architecture was incredible. It was all white with what looked like gray trim. Someone might even have mistaken it for a castle if they were far enough away. But we saw it as our ticket out of there, so we scrambled up the hill towards it anyway. Once we reached the house, I realized it was much bigger than I had originally thought. It had at least 3 floors, and I could see a large balcony on the top floor. The enormous yard in which we stood in was freshly cut, and the rest of the landscaping looked to be in good condition too. Someone must have been home. Louis and I rushed into the porch and stood before the front door, and for a brief moment we stopped to look at each other, as if to acknowledge the terrible decision we were about to make. He nodded with approval, and I rang the doorbell. We waited. I rang the doorbell twice more. No answer. Louis peeked through one of the windows, but didn't see anything. I tried the door myself. It was unlocked. My heart raced. I knew it was a bad idea. Nobody just walks into an unlocked house expecting the best, let alone one in the middle of the woods. I quickly took a mental list of our circumstances and knew we had to go inside. So we did. And to this day, I still wish we hadn't, for what awaited us inside, I'll never be able to forget. Strange childhood. Between 1989 and 1998, my family moved over 20 times. About twice a year, we'd get completely uprooted and have to start our lives over in a new city. My sister and I thought nothing of it since we were army brats and relocating had become second nature to us. Every morning our parents would change into their military uniforms, drop us off at school, and drive away in our rusty old clunker of a car. What my sister and I didn't know was that our parents had gotten discharged in 1991. We weren't moving because they were being reassigned. We were running. It was the summer of 1998, and we'd been living in the same dingy apartment for 7 months. My parents were getting a little stir-crazy, waiting for their new assignments. This was the first time we'd stayed in one place for so long, and I started believing we'd finally found a permanent home. Maybe I'd be able to make friends and actually keep them for once. Though the mood at home was tense, what with my parents constantly whispering between themselves, my social life was booming. I was being invited to birthday parties, went to sleepovers, and even signed up for an upcoming school trip. Things could not have been any better, until the night I went to the park alone. That evening, my parents were entertaining an old woman with a floral shawl covering her head. They didn't even notice me sneaking out the door. I made my way down the apartment complex, crossed the street, and walked into the park. On an old chain swing stood a man who seemed normal from the neck down. He wore a bright blue scarf, a black t-shirt, a pair of blue jeans, and running shoes. Things got a little weird from the neck up. He had on a white mask that almost seemed to glow in the dimming twilight. His dirty blonde hair fell over the solid curved edge lining his forehead. The mask was smooth and plain. The only details on it were the small holes where his nose should have been, a large black void for a right eye, and a smaller hole for a left eye. I knew that I should have turned and left right then, but like a moth to a bulb, I couldn't turn away. He's a murderer, a kidnapper, a mugger. The worst scenarios raced through my mind, but my frantic distrust could not stop my feet from drawing nearer. I was snared by the gravity of his silent presence and circled around him several times before stopping face to face. Not a word was spoken between us. He gestured for me to follow. In a dreamlike trance, I did. The masked man limped a few yards ahead of me, paying no mind to whether I had followed or not. He knew that I would. As the city blocks passed, I realized that he was leading me on a meandering path through my own neighborhood. Familiar storefronts passed us by on both sides, their windows dark and gazing out at the two of us like empty skulls. When he took a sharp turn through an alleyway, I should have known better than to pursue. In that dark alley, I stopped in my tracks, and instinctively he paused as well. "Can I see what's under your mask?" I asked. The stranger stood still for quite some time. Then he nodded and reached up to grasp the chin of the mask. With some effort, as if the thing were glued to his cheeks, he peeled the mask away. His head turned slowly to greet me, and I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. Where his facial features should have been, there was instead a flickering field of static. The entire span of his countenance looked like a television screen with no reception. Black and white lines shuddered and fizzled over his cheeks, his nose, and eyes. He pushed the mask back in place, then continued down the alley. Despite it all, I once again followed, and when we emerged from the other side, we found ourselves standing just outside the head-high shrubs that encircled my own backyard. The masked stranger pushed his body through the tangled foliage and crouched down low. I joined him and followed his gaze. Through the picture window, I saw my mother and my father standing over the elderly woman seated at the kitchen table. My mother paced across the kitchen, then stopped for a few moments next to my father before she shook her head and paced about again. My father exchanged words with the elderly woman while he prodded his finger into the table to punctuate certain phrases. I couldn't tell what was being said, even if I screwed up my eyes and tried to focus on their lips. The elderly woman simply sat at the table with a vacant smile and nodded. After a few minutes, my father slumped into the chair with his head in his hands. The woman placed a hand on his head. Her lips moved, and she took her hand away again. My mother threw her own hands into the air and screamed at the woman. I even heard the familiar tone of my mother's shout, but didn't catch the word. My father slumped further into the table, and my mother left the kitchen. I turned to the figure next to me. "What are they saying?" He didn't answer, but he placed a hand on my shoulder as if to comfort me, before rising and walking away. Before I could decide whether to follow him again or not, I heard the back door squeak open, and the elderly lady shuffle into the backyard. "Miguel," she called. "Miguel." I watched him take her arm and lead her out of the backyard. What had I just seen? What in God's name had I seen when he lifted that mask? It was becoming fuzzy in my mind. Had I seen static? Had I really seen white noise encompass his face? My stomach had tightened into a knot. but it only grew worse when I saw Mother sit back down at the table and begin to sob. I could feel Miguel's hand on my shoulder. The imprint he left as a friendly gesture felt electric and alive. When I rubbed my arm, a static discharge leaped out of me with a quick snap. I saw my father look through our apartment, and I knew he was looking for me. How I had to ignore every impulse to tell them what I had seen, because if I did, I knew that we would be all in danger. I somehow knew that this was more than just a neighborly visit. Somehow I had deduced that a bargaining chip had been laid on the table, and I was that chip. It was a little past midnight when my father came into my room and told me to pack. We were leaving immediately, but feeling the static rumbling in my shoulder, I knew that I had been marked and we couldn't run far. We stayed that night at a dilapidated motel off a one-lane road with barely 20 rooms and only 6 cars parked out front. My father paid cash, hustled my sister and I to the room. My mother stayed outside for a little while, doing God knows what. I think she might have even been praying when we left for the room, but she didn't come in until well after 4. I didn't sleep that night. My sister and I were crammed into one bed, with my mother and father in another, with only a foot of space between the two. My sister asked me if I knew what was happening. I told her that I didn't, which was true. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't understand what the static in my shoulder meant. I could feel it there under the surface like pins and needles, but somehow moving of its own accord. My sister touched me on the shoulder just once to reassure me. The next morning my sister complained that her hand had gotten pins and needles in the night, and that it wasn't going away. My mother's face drew down, tight and pale, and my father punched a hole in the wall. They made her put on gloves. I swallowed down bile, and then we were packing and running again. We took the highway north, and after burning through the empty miles for several hours, we finally pulled into a truck stop for breakfast. It was almost 11 o'clock, and I could hear my sister's stomach growling as loudly as my own. Mom and Dad had a tense, whispered exchange as we drifted through the empty restaurant to a back table in a corner. I can remember that the table was bookended by a fake tropical plant on one side and a gaudy wooden statue of a native on the other. It was a grinning horror with bulging glossy eyes and huge square teeth. It watched her approach with a nasty species of avaricious glee, and its grotesque smile seemed to say, "Hiya, kid, you're marked. Did you know that? You're bought and paid for, my little friend." I knew that my parents were arguing about money. I was old enough to know that money was a finite resource, and adults did not have magic wallets that were somehow always bulging with the stuff. Hotels cost money. Gas cost money. And so do meals at run-down truck stops with peeling floral wallpaper and nightmarish wooden statues. I scanned the menu and chose the cheapest combo I could find. The kids' meal number 2 with 1 egg, 2 slices of toast, and a glass of milk or juice. My stomach grumbled unhappily, and I told it to shut up and deal with it. I had a sinking feeling that my stomach's rumbling would soon become a familiar sensation. Of course, the question was trembling on the tip of my tongue. What was happening to us, and why? I wanted to ask so badly that it burned, but my father's stony expression forbade inquiry of any kind. My mother seemed disconnected from us, vague and distant. She didn't even acknowledge our waitress. She just stared out the window with watery eyes and clutched her hands together on the table, clutched them so hard that her fingers turned red. We ate in silence. The statue watched me chew my toast and grinned. I finished first and waited impatiently. My bladder started to throb, so I cleared my throat and quietly announced that I had to use the restroom. My dad nodded absently. He was folding and refolding a napkin on the table, and his hands were shaking. The restroom smelled like old piss and something else, something dank and feral and wild. I did my business into a cracked old urinal and washed my hands in a sink that was clotted with shaving cream and long gray-brown whiskers. I was looking around for a hand dryer when a man's voice grated at me from behind the door of the toilet stall. I jumped and whirled around with a small shriek. "Hey, kid," it said. "Hey, come here for a moment, would you?" I froze, my hands dripping as suddenly cold as ice. I tried to answer and I couldn't. I tried to back up towards the door and I couldn't do that either. My feet were glued to the floor. The stall door swung open with a creak, and there stood a grizzled-looking trucker with an old Beowulf t-shirt pulled up over his hairy gut and his jeans pulled down around his meaty thighs. The trucker's penis stood out from a frizzled wad of black pubic hair like an exclamation point. He gave me a square-toothed grin that was almost identical to the native statue back out in the restaurant and started walking towards me, his erection bobbing in front of him as he advanced. "Shut up, kid," he whispered. He smelled the foul body odor and sick lunatic desire. I shrank away and my back hit the sink painfully. I grunted and made a whining sound in my throat. He smiled even wider. "You just shut the fuck up and don't let out a single peep, or I'll twist your balls off. You hear me, sweetness? I'll twist your fucking The trucker's descending hand abruptly clenched into a fist, then splayed out like a jittering spider. Miguel was standing behind him, and he had the trucker by the throat. His fingers sank into the man's neck like it was jello, and there was the sound of a steak sizzling on the hot grill of a barbecue. The trucker flailed and grasped at the hand around his throat. He beat on it with his fist, clawed at it. His eyes bulged. A splurt of blood shot out of his neck and hit the wall, followed by a bigger one that flapped the fly-specked mirror with a dripping streak of red. Miguel's fingers disappeared entirely into the waddled meat of the trucker's neck, and he twisted his hand casually, effortlessly. I heard the trucker's neck snap, a wet and muted crick that made my mouth turn down in a quivering bow of horror. "The boy is mine," Miguel buzzed, and he shook the dying man like a rag doll. The toes of his work boots scraped back and forth across the tiles. His bladder went, and a weak dribble of urine leaked out of his wilting member, spattering the floor in front of him. "Not for you, no. The boy is mine. Mine, mine." The horror in the blank mask turned and flung the trucker across the room. He landed in the corner and slumped down into himself, glazed eyes looking at nothing. His limp neck was riddled with deep blackened punctures. There were emitting little curls of smoke. Miguel turned away silently and walked out of the restroom without acknowledging me further. After a moment, I forced myself to run after him. My feet seemed to be made of lead, and the narrow restroom had taken on the distorted dimensions of a football stadium. I thudded after him, and he was gone. The short hallway between the dining room and the restroom was empty. The air smelled strongly of ozone with a hint of onions long since fried and consumed. I wandered back to our table, pale and in shock. My parents didn't even notice that something was wrong, and I couldn't begin to imagine how I might tell them what had happened. It was too much, all of it. I basically shut down, withdrew into myself. I hummed tonelessly and waited for them to be done. Dimly I hoped that no one would discover the dead man in the restroom before we could get away. I hoped that I was actually dreaming, and that I would soon awaken with the blankets kicked off the bed and my pillow clutched tightly in my arms. I prayed for it. Before long, everyone had finished the last bits of toast and bacon, and we got up to leave. The statue watched as Dad paid for our meal, laughing at us silently. Soon the road swallowed us up, and I stared out the window without seeing, gazing blankly at a blur of endless fields and scrub woods. My sister asked me what was wrong, and I just shook my head. I didn't even try to give her a reassuring smile. I couldn't. A long day of driving turned into an even longer night. This time my parents weren't stopping for anything more than a few quick pit stops. They alternated between sleeping and driving, leaving us to entertain ourselves in the back seat. They barely even acknowledged us anymore. The night stretched out for what felt like an eternity. I was feeling homesick, which was an odd sensation for someone who had never really had a home to begin with. It must have been around 5 a.m. when I woke up and peeked between the front seats. From the windshield I could see the sunrise in the distance. Dad was snoring in the passenger seat and Mom was driving. She looked exhausted, barely clinging to consciousness. Her head kept dipping and jerking back up every so often, causing the car to swerve lightly. The sound of radio static filled the air, causing the hairs at the back of my neck to lift like a porcupine spike. I turned my gaze to the window on my right. It was like watching snow on the TV. My head quickly snapped to left, only to find the same blurred image had replaced the world around me. I could see the outlines of Miguel's mask slowly meld together from the white and black pixels covering the window closest to me. The white pixels glued together to form his face, and the black pixels congregated into his uneven dark eyes. I swallowed hard as a sensation of fear turned my body into ice. No one could protect me now. Not my mom, not my dad, not my sister, and probably not Mr. Scuzzy Pants, my sister's stuffed animal. Miguel's hand stretched out from the window and reached towards me. My eyes widened, and I opened my mouth to cry out, but no words came to me. I pushed towards the middle seat, clawing at the upholstery to put what little distance I could between myself and Miguel's reach. The pins and needles on my shoulders had amplified. The tingling had become intense to the point of agony. A shrill ringing screeched in my ears. My whole body was convulsing more violently the closer Miguel's hand came. Perhaps it was my shuddering or my pushing against her, or perhaps it was a static tingling on her own hand, but my sleeping sister's eyes snapped open just as Miguel's middle finger grazed the bridge of my nose. She shot up straight in her seat, clutched the headrest of my driver's seat, and shrieked. My mother, who had just dozed off in the seconds before, snapped awake at the sound of the screaming. The car had already drifted onto the shoulder, and the jolt startled my mother into a panic. She overcorrected towards the center lane, then overcorrected again back toward the shoulder. All control was lost. The car launched off of the shoulder over a 4-foot ditch that lined the roadside. The world was a static-filled blur spinning around me. The sound of crumbling metal roared in my ears. The smell of ozone and dust clogged my nose. Then a loud crash. Our sedan had careened right into a power line pole, and the chassis folded around it. The splintering wood groaned as the pole shifted out of its natural position. High above the twisted metal that our family was ensnared in, a power line snapped. A transistor exploded into a shower of blue sparks. The power line flailed through the air like a serpent. It whipped down across the side of the car, painting the passenger's door with a long black gash. The window beside my head shattered. Where was Miguel? Why wasn't my mother moving? I watched the power line writhing across the desert floor, kicking up sand and sparks and rocks. I lay crumpled with my sister in the back seat of the car. My mother was slumped against the driver's side door, my father lolled against the seatbelt. My sister whimpered, "You're squishing me." I shuffled off her, but as I moved, my head exploded in pain. The pins and needles joined in, and each moment was a little ripple of agony when I tried to use my arm. My sister leaned forward and began shaking our father and asked him to wake up. While she was pleading to him, I noticed her other arm limp at her side. I looked out the window of the car. We were still next to the main road, but it was the middle of the night, and there were no other cars in sight. I pulled myself out the window, but as I put weight on the wrong shoulder, my arm jerked out from under me, and I flopped majestically onto the dusty ground beneath me, with a myriad of tiny cuts from the glass. I groaned, and my sister popped her head out the ground. "What are you doing?" I stood and pulled at Mother's door. No good. The car's frame had been warped from the impact. "Come on," I waved to her. "We have to find someone." She shook her head. "No, it's dark. And what if we get lost? We just need to follow the road back to the last stop. Come on." She shook her head again with more conviction. "No, don't wander off. I don't like it." I tried to pull her out of the window, but she kicked herself back. "I'm going. We need to find a phone and call someone." With that, I headed back up the road, alone, with my sister calling my name after me. The broken power line chided after me. The whipsaw of sparks skating across the desert floor illuminated from behind. It was a sound reminiscent of sparklers, the kind we used during the 4th of July, the harmless variety. The glow of the embers would enthrall us until it burned out into a light glow of nothing. Was it really so long ago that this was the magic of our childhood? Was it all gone now, I asked myself. There was no sign of Miguel up ahead, but behind, the screeching and clacking of the line as the electrical mouth opened wide and shuttered again with those bright, angry sparks. I heard my sister scream and turned around. The line was writhing, but it had a trajectory now. It was moving, slithering towards the car. and in the face of those sparks I saw his face, this time grinning through his misshapen mask, the eye holes bright and alive and furious. Furious for not letting him take me, control me, become me, and he pulled a line through the static and discharge, pushed it as he was now the spark in the electricity. He was now the life in the line. I ran back, but not before the power line leaped into the pooling gas underneath. There, but for a moment, was a brief quiet as the broken line disappeared into the slick black pool. Then hell erupted around them. Brighter than the day that was growing, the desert became instantly white, and I was pushed back, this time by the angry hands of Miguel, who was no longer static, but a bright molten giant rising high above the car. His face, that goddamn ugly face, rose above, as my parents, oh, it did. My sister were rendered into nothing. The fire became a pillar and fell, where it chewed apart the car, chewed the insides with ferocious heat. I remained on the ground, helpless, shaking and alone. The static bit into my shoulder, it buzzed into my ears. Come here. I felt it had said, come. It commanded, but I was choking then, and I got back into my feet and ran, as the smell of the gasoline escaped my body through sweat, the taste of burnt rubber and hair still on my lips, and the last of my sister's brief screams echoing in my ears. I was filled with hate, pure, unadulterated loathing. I picked up a pile of sand and bit into it as the rocks of a lost millennia coated my mouth. Anything to take it away. Anything to kill my every breath. The sun was rising high now, and my hate grew with the intense vibration in my shoulder, as if something were breaking through my skin. I felt my brain split into shards. One shard was the here and the now, the one of fear and pain, of the shock of injury, and then there was the other one, the vile seething pain of static, of electricity, of some other fire quaking out of my pores. The air in every exhale was growing in cyclones of charged particles, as if the oxygen molecules I spewed were spinning, erupting, and charged. A fire truck warbled in the distance. The smoke from the burning car was visible, and someone somewhere had pulled an alarm. Dear God, did they know what they were coming for? And with every wail of the siren, I could hear Miguel screaming with laughter. Closer and closer they came. The siren swelled and filled the air around me, overwhelming and burying the screeching hiss of our family car burning into a charred, molten wreck. I tried to crawl into the ditch and collapsed with my face in the scrub of weeds that bordered the shoulder of the road, quivering with shock and pain. My arm was broken, and the tingle of Miguel's presence was sinking into my flesh like a million electrified hooks. I choked on dust and pebbles and my own wretched sobs. A fire truck and 3 black SUVs screeched to a halt on the road beside me. Doors opened, and a tumble of figures piled out and swarming to attend to unknown business, as a fireman hustled the hose over to the car. To the people who jumped out of the SUV slowly strolled over to where I lay on the gravel, their faces deeply lined and impassive behind their mirrored sunglasses. I can remember that they were both very tanned and weathered, and had almost identical iron-gray crew cuts. One of the men was holding a pistol stiffly at his side. They stood over me and studied me for a moment in a clinical, detached manner, as if I weren't an injured child at all, but a specimen, a lab rat. Finally, one of the men turned to the other and said, "Well, I'll be goddamn, Major. I think he's the real one. Finally, at long last. It must be him. Would have started buzzing and snarling at us by now if he wasn't. And look, he's even bleeding." To me he said, "Are you hurt, son?" I nodded. My throat was too dry and gritty to speak. I've never wanted water so badly in my life, before or since. The Major nodded. "The original copy, all right. Poor little bastard. Call over Sergeant and Corporal Smith to confirm. I suppose. Let's just get this over with." The other man gave him an impatient little wave, and he strode away stiffly, pistol still in hand. He looked down at me from behind twin mirrored walls of his shades, his mouth a stiff little slash below his crooked nose. My own pale, miserable face watched me from inside the lenses, and we all waited for whatever was coming next. The major returned with a man and a woman, both dressed in the same black, paramilitary-looking cargo pants and multi-pocketed Kevlar vest as the major and his grim companion. The new man removed his sunglasses and scanned my face with narrowed eyes. Bright blue eyes, bracketed by coarse eyebrows. One of them crossed with a fine scar. Unmistakable eyes. It was my father. The man who just burned alive in the car. The man who was now a wet, charred thing in the passenger seat, smoldering and dead. I gasped and sat upright. God, he said. Oh my God, it's him. Son, are you okay? Are you... Step aside, please, Corporal. You know what needs to be done now. This is it. The end of the line. My dad nodded, and his eyes were suddenly bright and shimmering in the strong morning sunlight. He wiped them roughly, and his voice was harsh and trembling. He said, Yes, sir. I know what needs to be done. He drew in a deep breath and said, Sergeant? Now. The woman whipped forward at the waist and slammed her forehead into the major's nose. Crunch. It splattered like a tomato. As he started to stagger back, she drove the sole of her high black boot into his kneecap. He shrieked and tumbled down into the gravel, raising his gun as he fell. A shot boomed out and missed. The woman leaped into the air like an acrobat and landed with a scream and a stomp to the major's head. He let out a gurgling cry and his legs started jittering, plowing away the stones and digging grooves into the dirt beneath. He looked like he was trying to do the foxtrot on his back. As this was happening, my father turned faster than a cat and drove fists like pistons into the other man's chest, stomach, and lower abdominal area in rapid succession. Whap, 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 and the other man fell with a pained grunt. My father jumped forward and the man scissored his legs from beneath him, sending him sprawling to the ground on his palms. Dad kicked free and they both rolled to their feet and drew their sidearms on each other simultaneously, fingers on their triggers. There was a shout from the vehicles nearby and my would-be executioner held out a palm, signaling them to wait. He grinned at my dad and gasped, I knew you wouldn't be able to let it happen, Corporal. I fucking knew it. You're weak as piss and always have been. Gutless. Now, stay right where you are, Sergeant. Don't be stupid. You make one more move and the Corporal and I will die together. You want me dead, I presume. But what about your beloved other half over there? Rest easy, sweetheart. You can't win this. Please, just let us go, sir, my dad panted. His eyes twitched. Just let us walk, okay? Jalila and her freak show won't come after us. I don't see it happening. It's over for them. They'll just go back to whatever hell it is that you people opened in the first place, won't they? The older man regarded him silently, and Dad pressed on, his voice tight with desperation. All the replications have been destroyed now. That's the last of them in that car. We can just walk away from this and you'll never see us again. I promise. We'll disappear. I don't believe that you would. See, and that's the problem. The man shook his head. You'd go away for a while, sure. But this is too big a secret to keep forever, isn't it? It would change everything, the whole world. People would no longer have the need for government or big business if they knew about the other side, would they? The truth about life after death? If it got out, well, the whole works would collapse. And there's certain people out there who wouldn't want that to happen. They like being on top, and they want to stay there. Those people wouldn't be happy if I let you go, Corporal. No can do. Sorry. I'll shoot you, you son of a bitch. Do you understand that? I'll die, but you'll die too. But your wife doesn't need to die, does she, Corporal? My father winced, and the older man smirked at this, amused by the power of his words. Because she will. Those folks over there, your brothers and sisters in the armed forces, they'll mow her down the instant you pull that trigger. Like I said, there's no winning here. The game is already lost. And so is your son. Just stand down, Corporal. Take the sergeant here and go sit in one of the trucks. Turn up the stereo, hold each other like lovebirds do, and let me do my goddamn job, you hear me? Don't do it, my mom said. She was crying, the dead man at her feet already forgotten. Don't you dare. Kill that twisted bastard. Shut up, bitch, he growled to my father. That's bad advice, son. You don't have to do this. You can walk away from this operation, not ever. But you can live. My father's eyes, tears spilled down his cheeks. No, I can't do that. I can't let you kill my own son. The man took a deep breath and said, Fine, have it your way. And abruptly there was the sound of men screaming, hard and harsh, and sudden in the still air. The fireman's hose was glowing a brilliant crackling white, and they were dancing along its length in the throes of electrocution. A surge of electric power was streaming from the smoldering car into the metal spout at the hose's end, and the thing was snapping and hissing like lightning. The firemen's heavy jackets were on fire. As I watched, someone's helmet explode and his head burst ablaze like a candle. Holy Jesus, the man screamed. Get the truck started. The barrel of his gun wandered to the right for just a split second, and in that hairbreadth of time my father dived to the left and pulled the trigger. The automatic pistol boomed and the older man jerked backward, a puppet with tangled strings and a quarter-sized hole in his forehead. He fired on dying reflex and the shot missed. As the dead man crumpled and fell to the road, my mom and dad scooped me up under the arms like a sack of potatoes and jumped into the ditch. The fire truck sizzled and exploded a second later. A roar filled the sky above us, a metallic grinding that hurt my ears and made me cry out. My mom pulled me tightly into the rough material of her vest. Miguel's voice boomed like Armageddon above us. He was rising from the fire truck, an electric apparition 20 feet high. The other soldiers were scattering before him like panicking ants, and he surged after them, still roaring in fury. His face was a crackling static ovoid the size of a billboard, and I screamed at the sight of it. It was like a doorway to somewhere else, somewhere alien and terrifying. My parents curled themselves around me, and we all screamed together. The boy is mine, he bellowed, and bolts of slender lightning shot out of his body like harpoons, slamming into the fleeing soldiers and lighting them instantly ablaze. They staggered and shrieked in blue cocoons of flame, sizzling and popping. Miguel turned to us and stomped across the road to stand above us, his feet melting into the asphalt with every step. He leaned over us and cooed in unintelligible squawks and blurts. The boy's no longer yours, Miguel. Begone, a woman's voice barked, and the apparition looming over us screamed in fury, then winked out of existence. There was a pop as the air collapsed into the void where he had just been. In his place was the old woman from the kitchen, her shawl pulled tightly around her head. Her face was deeply creased and wrinkled, her eyes dull and yellow. She looked older than time itself. I will be back, she said, simply. And then she too was gone. It was Jalila. I didn't know it then, but I do now. I know more now than I'd ever wanted to. Believe me. My father bundled me into his arms, and my parents ran to one of the SUVs. My sister was in the back seat, crying and clutching her stuffed toy in a death grip. They put me in beside her, and we were on the move, squealing down the highway in a rolling cloud of dusk. I stared at my sister dully, then put my good arm around her and looked out the window as she sniffled into my dirty t-shirt. I was exhausted and in shock. Reality had crumbled from beneath my feet, and I had plunged into the abyss, a place where people are not who they seem to be, and the laws of nature meant nothing. It was too much for a kid, or anyone for that matter. I had many, many questions, but that was for later. Right then and there was enough to be back with my family again. It was enough. In the coming days and weeks, my mom and dad pieced together the puzzle for me, and I did my best to grasp it. They had been sent to Iraq in 1989 on a top-secret mission, leaving toddler me and my baby sister in the care of a military-funded au pair. Deep in the Kwandal Mountains of northern Iraq, an ancient gateway had been discovered, a gateway to another place, a different dimension, a different universe. They were sent in with a team of scientists, SEALs, and infantry on an exploratory mission, with a local woman as a guide, a wiry old woman named Jalila. They entered the gateway and found themselves in a gigantic cavernous white room, the only object in the room being a white fuzzy sphere that floated in the air. It was entrancing, they said, and two of the group approached it with slack jaws and outstretched hands. Jalila and a grunt named Miguel. The others shouted at them to stop, but they didn't, with disastrous results. The sphere shot some sort of pulsing energy into their bodies, and they became something else. Something not human. Replications of the entire team jumped out of the sphere, dozens of replications of each team member, and the firefight ensued. My mother and father escaped and ran up the mountain. The others did not. Jalila, Miguel, and the replicants followed my parents into our world, and there has been a war going on ever since. A secret war against an enemy that we can hardly even begin to understand. Replicants of my parents made their way back to America. They killed the au pair and snatched me and my sister. We were on the run from my own parents. Was a part of an elite mission to hunt them down. Were dedicated to finding and eradicating every last one of them. The gateway was destroyed, but it was too late. Jalila and her monster servant were loose in our world, and the very balance of our world's existence was at stake. When I saw Jalila in our kitchen that day, I met Miguel in the park. She was informing my parents' imposters that the other replications were all dead, and that the team was zeroing in on them rapidly. That's why we went on the run again. When all the replicants were destroyed, there would no longer be a physical manifestation of their world in ours, and Jalila and Miguel's own physical bodies would fade. It's hard to explain, but the replications were like a thread upon which Jalila and Miguel dangled precariously. When the thread was broken, they would fall back into that other realm. That's the best I can explain it. I still don't really understand the science behind it. I don't think anyone really does, not fully. Miguel had been transformed into a vampire of sorts, a being that drains the human vitality out of his victims and replaces it with his own essence. He'd chosen me as his next meal, infected me with his strange energy like a spider injects its digestive venom into a fly. This is why the director wanted to execute me. I was turning into one of them. I was ill for months afterwards, but eventually the effects faded, and I got better. We were still on the run, but this time from our own government. We made our way to Mexico and then into Central America. My parents settled in the jungle of Costa Rica, and my training began. Because this isn't over yet, not by a long shot. There are other gateways to their world from ours, other replicants, other versions of Miguel. I've seen and done a lot in the past decade, things that would make most people lose their minds. Jalila did come back, as promised, but that's another story for another time. I have to stop telling this story now. There's business to be seen to in South Africa. My parents are getting on in years, and the crown has been passed to me and my sister. We have a duty to protect you all from the horrors that lie beyond the gateways. While you live your lives unconcerned and unaware, I battle monstrosities on a weekly basis. But, like I already said, that's a story for another time.